So let's take a look at one last thing dealing with economic growth, and that is what goes on in a particular country when economic growth occurs. Now, admittedly, what you're about to see is not a real country, but it does give us a really interesting illustration of how economic growth can occur in certain places when the institutions are set up properly.
Baba,
Yes, my son.
tell me a story.
Which one?
The story of home.
Millions of years ago, a meteorite made of vibranium, the strongest substance in the universe, struck the continent of Africa, affecting the plant life around it. And when the time of men came, 5 tribes settled on it and called it Wakanda. The tribes lived in constant war with each other until a warrior shaman received a vision from the panther goddess Bast, who led him to the heart-shaped herb, a plant that granted him superhuman strength, speed, and instincts. The warrior became king and the first Black Panther, the protector of Wakanda. 4 tribes agreed to live under the king's rule, but the Jabari tribe isolated themselves in the mountains. The Wakandans used vibranium to develop technology more advanced than any other nation. But as Wakanda thrived, the world around it descended further into chaos. To keep vibranium safe, the Wakandans vowed to hide in plain sight, keeping the truth of their power from the outside world.
And we still hide, Baba?
Yes.
Why?
Wakanda grew on a continent where there was very little economic growth, and there has been very little economic growth over the last few hundred years. One of the reasons why they grew was because they were able to maintain a peaceful society. They didn't fall prey to the wars that were going on around them. They didn't have to worry about, or they didn't worry about slavery and the impact that that had on their society. Wakanda had this advanced technology that nobody else had. They had institutions that promoted economic growth that other countries didn't have. They didn't have the type of dictators that take the resources and use them for their own aggrandizement, which is something called the resource curse. The Black Panther used the vibranium to help his people live better lives. So that's an illustration of a way that institutions can have a huge impact on economic growth. And just to follow up on that, let's take a look at how economic growth in Wakanda occurs with some numbers. Okay, so here are some fictional measures of GDP for the country of Wakanda in the year 950, before vibranium came, up to the year 1000. So we have GDP of $10 million, of course adjusted for inflation over time, and a GDP of $10,100,000 over the course of these 50 years. So we can figure out the GDP growth rate by looking at GDP in the year 1000 and GDP in the year 950. Take the difference and divide that by GDP in 950 and multiply it by 100. So go ahead, take a few minutes here, maybe pause the video and see if you can calculate that number. there's your answer. It's 1%. So GDP grew by 1% from 950 to 1,000. 1% is not terrible, but it's not that big of a deal. Now, let's see how things change when vibranium hits Wakanda. We know what the GDP was in the year 1000. In the year 1960, so a long time, admittedly, 960 years, we see that GDP in Wakanda has increased substantially to over $6 billion, $6.8 billion. 1960 is the year that Black Panther first showed up in the Marvel comics, so that's why I picked that year. So if we put these numbers in place into our equation, we can figure out the growth rate from the year 1000 to the year 1960 for Wakanda. So go ahead and do that. The growth rate of Wakanda from the year 1000 to the year 1960 is over 67,000%. That's like superhuman. That's just amazing. Now, GDP in Wakanda has continued to grow, of course, over time as they've taken this technology and this natural resource that they have and put it into practice and continued to develop it. So let's take a look at one last set of data here and see if we can calculate the GDP growth rate. All right, so here we have our data from 1960, and now I've added data from 2018. So in 1960, we have 6.8 billion, or 6,826,255,000. In 2018, GDP is 399,455,850,000. So put those numbers into the equation that we've been using and see if you can calculate the real growth rate for this country, or the growth rate in GDP for this country. All right, so hopefully you got the answer of 5,751 about 76%. So 5,000% GDP growth. since 1960. It's not quite as impressive as the growth rate between the year 1000 and 1960, but it's still pretty significant. I want to let you in on a little something here. These numbers, of course, are not real. Wakanda is not a real place. So I had to come up with the data somewhere. And the data is actually the data for South Korea. These are the actual growth numbers for that nation, South Korea, that we started talking about with economic growth. It's an absolutely amazing thing that a country that basically started off so very poor in 1960, relatively speaking, could grow to be such an incredibly large and powerful economy over time. Economic growth is a really important aspect of macroeconomics and for changing people's lives. The more we can understand about it, the better we can all be.